Our next case study is on global adjustment mitigation. It was addressed earlier today on the electricity market, and I thought we would do is we would take the information that we can glean off the bill, and we're going to ask Paul Weingartner, that's with ECNG, to come up and talk a little bit about how do you use that information? How can it benefit you? So, Paul, come on up.
Make sure everyone can hear me. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to see everyone, and as one of the suppliers that work with Orma on a day in and day out basis, we're definitely hearing the concerns from their members as it relates to their overall costs. And this year is quite a unique one when you look at it from the perspective that we had cap and trade implemented January 1st. That represents about a 16% increase in your total gas costs going forward. As well, we have our minimum wage concerns, which Fatima mentioned. And ultimately, in the accommodation sector, when we look at your power bills, and specifically your global adjustment, there are some unique changes that have occurred as of July 1st that are overall impacting your global adjustment costs. And as I go through this presentation, it's kind of interesting. I was pulling together some slides, and there was one or two of them that I had created about, I think it was 8-9 years ago, to address a concern that one of our clients had. And the client was specifically concerned over the fact that they had invested $1 million in conservation and demand management measures, but their total power costs had increased. Specifically, their finance department was on them. Thought you said we were gonna save money. So they brought me out and we sat down and we talked and went through all this information. And I said, well, see, you're saving money because you would have paid more had you not undertaken these initiatives. And he looked me straight in the eyes and he goes, that's not savings, that's cost avoidance. So ever since that conversation about 8 or 9 years ago, I learned my lesson, and now we talk about cost avoidance. What would you have paid otherwise? So I'll start on my presentation here, and hopefully I can work this thing. Here we go. So GA mitigation, and I like to look at things from a simple standpoint because I'm a simple person. And I like to completely understand what this means to me, my operations, and more importantly, our clients on a go-forward basis. So maybe a little shameless self-promotion. ECNG is Canada's largest and longest standing full-service energy solution provider. We do take a holistic approach. Although our background is in procurement of gas and power, starting about 30 years ago with the deregulation of natural gas, with a deregulation of power here in Ontario, obviously we've expanded to include that. And over the years, our members have turned to us and our clients have turned to us and said, we need more. We need to not only reduce the cost per unit, but we need to reduce the number of units we're consuming and understand the regulatory framework that's been laid out to us and what that means to our businesses. So a bit of an agenda. I guess before we understand what game we're playing and what strategies we're going to implement, we need to understand the field that we're playing on. So hopefully with a little bit of a recap and building off of what has already been presented, I can provide a little further insight as to what the global adjustment is, some strategies to mitigate it, and then last I'll end with one slide which does apply to one hotel that we're working with, and it relates to cogeneration and the projects that they're undertaking. So a little bit of history. The global adjustment, you might know, has been around since 2005. Back then it was referred to as the provincial benefit. More recently it's changed to the global adjustment. As well, the costs change every month. So it's pretty dynamic in the sense that the overall costs that we have to remit back as a province do change each month, and they're inversely related to the price of electricity in the province. And as well, when it's collected as a Class B user, and actually historically everyone was a Class B user, it's spread across the number of kilowatts or megawatts consumed as a province. So that amount or that factor fluctuates each month as well. Every consumer in the province pays for the global adjustment. Even you at your homes under the regulated price plan or the RPP, you are covering off these costs, obviously through a prescribed rate that the province has put out. It did start as a credit. Some of you may recall that or may not recall that. It became a slight charge, and then in and around 2008, 2009 is where we saw the global adjustment start to balloon. And obviously that was tied to the reduction in demand for the province. So this is the simplest way I get this straight in my head. The global adjustment is a simple calculation of the total monthly obligations we have as a province. What are these obligations? These obligations are predominantly generation contracts that we have in place. As well, they're conservation initiatives that we're funding. So we have this bucket of money that needs to be paid out each month as a province. And previously and historically, the way that that money is recuperated is they're taking the total consumption in the province and dividing it equally. Simple little equation. Unfortunately, what happened in around 2008 is we went into a recession. So the demand for electricity fell. Laws of supply and demand. The price of electricity falls as well. So unfortunately, our numerator starts to increase. Why? Because we have to cut bigger checks back to these generators to ensure that we've met our obligations for them. Unfortunately, though, supply and demand, if consumption or demand is dropping, that's not a good thing in this little equation. So your numerator is going up, your denominator is going down, and ultimately we end up in a situation where your global adjustment is probably, if not the largest line item on your power bill each month. So just to emphasize this point, and it probably builds off of Robert's bar graph showing in the red line here, if you can see it, that's the average hourly Ontario electricity price. And you can see over time, it's in a little bit of a downward trend. There is the polar vortex there where we saw the price of electricity escalate during the winter months. As well, you can see in the black line, the overall global adjustment. And then the green line is the combination of the two. So this upward trend on the overall cost of electricity, not necessarily the price of electricity, is what we're battling. For all intents and purposes, the price of electricity is low. It's about 1 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So there's really not much you can do there, which is why I wanted to focus on the global adjustment today. So the most important thing about strategizing around your global adjustment costs is understanding what game you're playing. And there are two distinct games that are being played in the Ontario market right now. So the Class A, which is also the ICI initiative, which has already been explained today, was predominantly reserved for large users in the province. Initially, back in 2011, it was reserved for those consuming over 5 megawatts. It then was reduced down to 3 megawatts, but only for specific sectors in the market. And then more recently, it was actually dropped to 1 megawatt or half a megawatt, depending on what industry you're in. And for all intents and purposes, what these players in the Class A are doing is they're looking to mitigate their usage during 5 specific hours during the year. And that qualifying period, as I've called it here, runs May to April each year. So for them, the game that they're looking at is, 1, knowing when those peaks are going to happen, and 2, what actions can I take during those occurrences to reduce my overall global adjustment exposure? So ultimately, they come to companies like ours to say, 1, when are those peaks going to happen? And we help them understand that. And 2, look for strategies to reduce their usages during those peak times. Unfortunately, for the rest of us, we're stuck on Class B. And this is predominantly reserved for smaller users, anyone below that 1 megawatt, okay? And typically, they're using what's called the first estimate for the global adjustment to calculate your GA charges on your bill. This is interesting because unlike under the Class A, where you're paying a fixed share of the global adjustment pie, on the Class B, your costs are a little more volatile because they're taking your monthly consumption, which vary month to month, and they're taking an estimate of what the global adjustment they think will be for this month, plus or minus what might have not been recuperated in the prior month. So you have 2 variable items that are coming together each month and multiplying to come up with your global adjustment costs on your invoice. So that's an important thing to consider. And this slide here is hopefully describing what I call the $12 billion pie. So right now, our overall annual global adjustment costs are sitting roughly at around $12 billion. And the game is, what share of this pie am I going to take on an annual basis? For the Class A users, they're looking to reduce their top 5 hours and reduce their overall small percentage of that pie. And in aggregate, what we're seeing is those Class A users are displacing substantial costs. They're avoiding substantial global adjustment costs on an ongoing basis. What does that mean? Well, unfortunately, those costs don't disappear. They get downloaded to others that haven't been as proactive or as energy efficient as their rivals or their neighbors in the market. So usually what that means is that the Class B users, who are left paying a portion of the pie based on their monthly consumption, are incurring a substantial portion of those costs. So as that pie got bigger, unbeknownst to you, your share of that pie was more than likely getting larger and larger over time. And there probably could be a third section of this pie, which I would call residential or small industrial or commercial users, anyone below about 250,000 kilowatt hours a year. For them, their concerns aren't that great. Why? They now have the Fair Hydro Act, which is providing about 25% relief on their power bills. So it's really this middle class, which probably represents a majority of the clients or consumers in this room, that are left to really fend for themselves as to how they're going to mitigate their global adjustment exposure on an ongoing basis. Just want to make sure I'm hitting all my points here. So taking control of your global adjustment costs. It starts with understanding what you've done to date, what you're doing now, and what you're looking to do in the future. Our GA mitigation service really started prior to in and around 2011, where we were focused on these Class A users. Once again, trying to understand when those 5 coincidental peaks were going to occur, and then looking for opportunities to reduce costs or reduce consumption during those peak hours. And the quick math on this is, for every megawatt you can reduce in one of those 5 hours, that's $100,000 a year in global adjustment mitigation. And I would argue that that's actually increasing over time, because ultimately there's less and less incentive to be a Class B user. You want to be either up in the Class A or down in the in the residential or low consumer sector. So the opportunity to reduce these costs is substantial, given the fact that your global adjustment is about 60 to 80% of your total electricity costs. And ultimately, the theory is, if you can eliminate those top 5 peaks and consume zero electricity on those hours, you pay zero global adjustment costs, which creates a unique situation because the actual price of electricity is sitting around 1 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour, as I mentioned. So this is the game that these larger users are undertaking to reduce their overall global adjustment costs. Unfortunately, for Class B users, the order is a little bit taller in the sense that they need to reduce their total consumption. But I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and there are some unique opportunities as a Class B user in the province. And one of those that you might overlook is the fact that your time of use and when you reduce your total consumption is somewhat irrelevant when it comes to GA mitigation under the Class B. What do I mean by that? If you were to save 1,000 kilowatt hours as a Class B user, when you do that, it's somewhat irrelevant because it's basically a blanket cost per kilowatt hour that's being charged on a monthly basis. So if you could reduce usage in off-peak times, when facilities aren't occupied or being used, you have that advantage. A Class A user doesn't, because it's going to be that 5-hour period, or those 5 hours, those 5 unique hours during the year, whether you're fully occupied or not. They have to be able to play that game, whereas you have a lot more flexibility in how you deploy your strategies. So that ultimately is driven by understanding what are your usage patterns, what efficiencies can I identify, and when can I curtail? As I mentioned, as a Class B users, those hours are somewhat irrelevant, but for a Class A, they're very specific, and they're becoming tougher and tougher to identify as more and more participants join into the Class A game. So determining the internal strategies, you got to understand, what are my benefits versus my costs? What does this mean in terms of someone's satisfaction with our facility and their experience as they're within your building? evaluating the feasibilities, and then obviously continually monitoring these strategies to once again not understand maybe what you're saving, but the cost that you're avoiding on an ongoing basis. So typically we try to look at this from three perspectives, and it's really just scaling up from the low-hanging fruit to ultimately generating your own electricity and potentially not pulling that power from the provincial grid. So anything like load shifting, laundries, reduced lighting, cooling, things of that nature would fall into what we call direct production curtailment. And once you get past that, it's the non-production base loads. So what are my chillers, if they're actually chillers, or depending on what your system is? What are those steps that we can take to reduce overall usages? Cycling our systems, performing setbacks in rooms when they're not occupied. And then we look to say, okay, we've tapped out all this low-hanging fruit, if you will, or other things. What can we look at now? And now we start to look into on-site generation, combined heat and power, or cogen. Battery storage, although that may not be a good solution for a Class B user because you're actually consuming electricity to charge up the battery. So maybe for a Class A user, that's something that you would want to look at. But this is how we make our way down the chain of where are the opportunities and implementing the strategy that's going to maximize the dollar for your efficiencies. And just some other examples here. So demand response, battery storage I mentioned, cogen, recommissioning, system cycling, and the last point, which we've already beaten quite a bit this morning, there's always incentives available for each one of these initiatives. Even your demand response. If you can curtail your usages during specific times and you're a Class A user, that provides a double opportunity to get the incentive and potentially reduce your global adjustment costs on an ongoing basis. So just a quick example here, the accommodation sector, typically cogeneration is not one that they think of or automatically go to. But in other sectors like multi-res, healthcare, and industrial space, this definitely is something a little bit more common. But we do have one hotel that we are working with that has undertaken through the ISO the application process to implement a cogeneration project. And ultimately, they're looking to use these generators not just to produce electricity, so ultimately reduce your global adjustment exposure, but also sort of capture or harvest the heat or the thermal energy from these units to achieve other efficiencies on the gas side. So they're almost getting a double benefit here in the sense that they're eliminating some of their GA exposure as well. They're also saving on the heat requirements that they have for their pool, domestic hot water, and other needs throughout the year. And if I'm not mistaken, the minimum threshold I think is about a 65% efficiency on the system to qualify for, I'm getting some nods, okay, so at least I know somewhat what I'm talking about, to receive the funding, which I think goes up to about 40% of the project. So there are substantial benefits here, but it all depends how your facility is set up, what systems you have, what opportunities you have to capture that heat. And beyond that, unfortunately, the incentives wouldn't necessarily be available from the province, but there still could be a business case to look at things like cogeneration. There's quite a bit of flexibility in terms of engine size nowadays. Before, you used to be constrained to really big projects. Now we're looking at anything from 50 to 200 kilowatt for facilities that are the size of traditional hotels. But ultimately, we're looking to size everything based on your thermal load, not necessarily your electrical load, which I think is a prudent decision in this case. And as well, one other thing to consider is in some cases, you can build in backup capabilities with these cogen units. So that gives you the opportunity to keep your facility up and going during outages in some cases, and potentially build off some redundancies of your current backup systems, whatever those might be. And in this case, we have, for this one instance that we're working on right now, the payback's around 5.3 years, which is probably a bit of a conservative number, but they are receiving the efficiencies on the gas and the power, as I mentioned. So that's all I have. Any questions, concerns, comments? You want to go back to any slides?
Paul?
Yes.
Just one comment.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Long-term energy plan came out in the direction from the Minister of Energy
Yep.
has clarified that these on-site generation incentives availability end July 1st, 2018.
Yep.
So for those of you who are interested, we have a firm date now. We weren't able to tell you what it was. We didn't know what it was, and now we know what it is. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to speak with consultants and your teams, and if it's a fit for you, you have, I think, about 8 months to get your application in.
One caveat to that, it did provide a bit of an opportunity for that program to continue so long as it was combined with some sort of
Waste.
green waste initiative, right?
Absolutely. That's,
Okay.
I'm referring specifically to the natural gas generation aspect to that
Yep.
CHP, where the 40% incentive applies.
Sorry.
Absolutely. No,
Yeah.
thank you for the clarification. For
So
sure.
there are secondary iterations of that program coming forward past 2018.
Yep.
Excellent. So I guess unless there's any other questions, one of the key things that I always work with our members and clients on is understanding where your costs are coming from and understanding how they're going to change going forward. And currently the landscape for the global adjustment is one such that you constantly have to sharpen your knives and you have to have constant improvement in how you're playing the game to ensure that you're mitigating your exposure to that global adjustment. And that game's going to differ whether you're Class A or Class B, and frankly, who knows? Maybe they're going to lower the threshold on the Class A going forward to include more and more users. In my opinion, it's probably one of the most effective programs we have in place in terms of destroying peak demand during on-peak times, and this past summer was a prime example of how that worked. Okay. Thanks.